Hello, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. This is Christopher Snowdon. You're watching The Swift Half with Snowdon. I hope you're doing well. Hope you've had a good couple of weeks. We're back again, and this time I'm very pleased to say that my guest is the Telegraph columnist, Tim Stanley. Tim, how's it going?
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here.
Good. I gather you've got a book out. Can you tell us about this? Whatever Happened to Tradition, I think.
It's called Whatever Happened to Tradition. It's out on October the 14th, and it is a history and a defense of the concept of tradition. And my central argument is that tradition is both something that is beautiful, or can be beautiful, but also practical, in that it can help us to cope with great change. And I illustrate how, particularly since the 18th century, clever societies have moved forward while dressing up change and progress as actually being about being loyal to the past. And I think this is something we can learn from today.
So this is really the classic case for conservatism, really, the Burke argument that you don't keep everything exactly the same, but you're very cautious about change and you respect traditional institutions.
And it would be untraditional to resist change. That's one of the geniuses of most traditions, is that actually they fluctuate over time, they change, they interact with each other, and what you end up with looks very different to what you began with. But good traditions have core foundational principles, which means that if you take the history of that tradition, you go back and forth, you can see the changes, but you can also see that the thing remains substantially the same. So a classic example is the monarchy. Queen Elizabeth II is no Henry VIII. Thank goodness. We don't have a divine right of king kind of monarch anymore. We have a constitutional one, but she's still a monarch. She's still a tradition, a living tradition. So yes, it is actually built into the DNA of traditions to change. And by doing that, you can progress while, as I say, retaining some sense of yourself and a sense of stability. This is what conservatism is about. This is what old-fashioned pre-20th century conservatism was all about, but it's been a bit forgotten because conservatism got sidetracked onto other issues during the 20th century. But I think we're coming back to these big issues of how to actually handle technological, economic, and social change.
Now, I confess I probably haven't read enough about conservative principles and don't have a sound enough theoretical underpinning of conservatism as I probably should. And that's partly because there are so few people around these days who are actually happy to be described as conservatives. I can only really think of you and Ed West and Peter Hitchens, who I kind of vaguely know, who are proud and out conservatives. So forgive me if some of these questions are rather naive, but how do you then decide when to make a change? If you, do you see what I'm saying? What's the criteria? You're respecting tradition. You think that tradition is basically a good thing, and yes, what you've got is basically good. So how then do you decide to make a change? And do you ever decide to make any kind of radical change?
Well, I think that most conservatives see things as being almost out of their hands, that it's a question of fate, that things like scientific and technological change are beyond the ability of politicians or philosophers to say we should or shouldn't do this. They're just happening. When you have something like the Industrial Revolution, you're not going to try to stop it. You can't stop it. So change just happens. Conservatism is inherently reactionary. It's about how do you respond to that change. There is the slightly tongue-in-cheek line by William F. Buckley that the job of the conservative is to stand athwart history crying stop. Now, he meant it as a joke. That's not literally what you do, but it does actually capture the spirit that conservatism to a certain extent is social critique. I mean, you said that, which is very interesting, there are very few conservatives around. Well, actually, if you go back through the corpus of philosophy, of conservative philosophy, there's not a lot of it, actually. There's not a lot of it which is straightforwardly people coming forward and saying, I'm a conservative and here's what needs to be done. Because conservative thinkers since the 18th century have really been reacting to events. They're not like, although Hegel to some extent is quite conservative in some regards, but they're not like Marx trying to create a new society. So they're not laying out a stool. They're reacting to things. So the simple answer is change happens. You probably can't stop it. The job of the conservative is to manage it or to try to cling on to the best bits of the past.
But what about when it comes to political change? I mean, I think you accept that when you've got scientific change, there's usually not much you can do about it, although, of course, a lot of people do try and stop things. I mean, Peter Hitchens is trying to get e-scooters banned at the moment, for example. I'm not sure if that's a conservative position or not. But when it comes to more radical change, something like, I suppose, gay marriage, or even something like I mean, this is something we've debated before. No, but cannabis. So cannabis was legal for a very, very long time, and then suddenly it became illegal, and it's been illegal for 100 years. So what is actually the conservative position on cannabis? What's the traditional approach to cannabis, where most of history it's been illegal, but for the most recent century it's been illegal?
I'm not copping out to say that I don't know. That's part of the genius of conservatism, is that it's like nailing a jelly to a wall. You raise a very good point there, that quite often things that conservatives defend are actually only a few generations old. So things like the consensus on drug policy. Well, actually, if you went back to the Victorian era, you could probably buy you could buy drugs in the drug capital of Britain back then, which was Ely. So you could just walk into a pharmacy and buy some Class A drugs. So you're absolutely right, because it does change over time. Sometimes conservatism is a game of saying which bit of the past do you want to go back to, or which bit of the past do you want to retain. Things like attitudes towards gender alter over time. The shape of families alter over time. Conservatives tend to be very much hooked on an Industrial Revolution era model of the family, of mum and dad against the world. Well, before that, human beings relied upon kinship networks, villages, and, if you like, the tribe. There was a very different model. So what would the conservative try to do? Would they try and preserve what they like from their generation, or would they actually try to go back? My point is, it's nuanced and complex. So it's difficult. The answer is it's very difficult to say. Having said that, though, I think conservatives tend to have loyalty to, as I said, certain fixed principles at any given time, which means that they can apply litmus tests to certain things. And the classic is, you mentioned gay marriage. Some people argued for gay marriage on the basis that this is an institution conservatives revere. Why not open it up to more people? But they came across conservatives who said, but if you do that, you're changing it so far that it's no longer what it actually was meant to be, which is a man and a woman with in principle, the possibility of procreation. So it's for the raising of children. So that's where you get a classic tension between conservatives, but where I think true conservatives would have some concern for the historic principles behind the institution, not just with keeping it going, and changing it beyond recognition.
So what is your beef with libertarians or classical liberals? What are the main differences you see between your philosophy and mine?
Don't assume I have any beef with them. Excuse me. First of all,
but you aren't one, right? So what's the dividing line?
I'm not one. But one argument which I was surprised to encounter when I wrote this book is that people like Hayek, and going back much further, Adam Smith, regarded themselves as guardians of tradition. And they argued, first of all, that the free market operates in a very traditional way because it's based upon social knowledge. It's based upon networks that evolved over time. It's not about someone saying, take this to there, sell this to that person. It's actually about people organically developing their own understanding of what my customers want. That is a classic model of how a non-state tradition functions. And secondly, Hayek and other classical liberals argued, look, the real innovation in the last 100 years was the welfare state. That's the thing which destroyed tradition in terms of families looking after people, or again, those kinship network ties. So I'm not by any means necessarily opposed to classical liberalism or libertarianism. The problem I have is that I think capitalism is a revolutionary force. And libertarians tend to like that aspect of it. It's the bit of it which alarms and frightens me. And I think it needs to be tempered. Part of the problem with the West is that we have a tradition which is anti-tradition. Since the Enlightenment, which, don't get me wrong, brought us many great advances and many things of which I personally have benefited. But since the Enlightenment, we've been hooked on a philosophy which is about constant change and reassessment. And that's bad for tradition. And you can wind up losing a sense of yourself and where you've come from because you're so hooked on self-analysis.
Can you expand on that then? What is it about capitalism that you find worrisome?
Well, because, so again, we have to distinguish, if we're going to be clever about this, we need to distinguish between capitalism simply as an economic process and capitalism as it has developed into today. So in principle, it should not necessarily be destructive. But the problem is that the pursuit of the profit can come at the expense of other things, which don't necessarily have a material value, but which can end up getting destroyed in the process. So, for instance, if you have a free market, it is inevitable that you'll get offshoring to other countries. The consequence is that a factory will close down in a Western country. And that has a terrible impact upon things that conservatives and traditionalists care about. It has an impact upon family. It has an impact upon church attendance, upon culture, all of those little organic things that have grown up around that factory existing. Now, is this a change you can necessarily stop? Well, possibly not. I'm just saying that conservatives usually are quite wary of that kind of change, whereas libertarians tend to embrace it because they see it as a good thing and part of life and about creating greater wealth down the road.
Yeah, because it is a good thing, surely. And people could have made the same argument, probably did make the same argument, when those factories were being built in Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries, that the villages were being stripped of all their people and so on and so forth. And people, if we were using the parlance of our times, would have called them sweatshops. But the reality was that although you do get this kind of creative destruction, it led to huge improvements in people's lives over the longer term. Now we're losing those factories and people are going into service jobs, which objectively are quite a lot nicer, frankly. People even complain about telesales offices being offshore to other countries. Well, telesales, frankly, isn't the greatest job in the world. The net effect of all this offshoring is really to improve people's jobs and wages, ultimately, isn't it?
Well, there are some things I agree with there. I find it intriguing that in some ways we're going back to a pre-industrial revolution economy. For instance, I find it so fascinating that artisanal quality crafts are coming back, which is actually something that the 19th century Christian socialists like William Morris and John Ruskin banged on about. That's exactly what they wanted. They wanted people to build things with their hands on the medieval model. So as the economy moves towards providing consumer goods which are of very high quality, you see a return to that. And also some people are starting to say, I don't want to travel into work, I'd rather live locally, I'd rather purchase local services. So in some ways, ironically, actually, the economy is sort of eventually returning back to what it was before. Where I disagree with you is I think that process is so disruptive that unless it is managed very intelligently, if one agrees that you probably can't entirely stop it, unless it is managed, there is a terrible risk that you end up uprooting people, and you create the circumstances for a degree of social calamity which actually undermines the case for capitalism itself. So in that sense, the free market is like the Enlightenment, is like liberalism. It's one of those traditions which eats itself because it ends up alienating so many people through its destructive process that it's going to eventually turn people against it.
Doesn't there need to be a certain amount of uprooting, though? I mean, I often say that one thing America has that Britain doesn't have enough of, these ghost towns. If you look at a lot of the places that sprung up during the course of the Industrial Revolution, they were only there because they were on a river or they were near coal, and they weren't towns or cities before, they were villages. Some of them weren't even anything. They were literally just people came from other parts of England or from Ireland or elsewhere, and they went to where the jobs are. And now, for various reasons, usually related to natural resources and natural kind of advantages, such as the coal either running out or you not being allowed to dig it, you've got to move to where the jobs are again. I don't see how it's possible, let alone anything else, to actually keep people in the same number of places as they were 150 years ago when the economy was totally different.
Yeah. First of all, we go back to that thing we just discussed of where does the Conservative decide they want things to stay at. So you've already had the uprooting, which is the agricultural revolution, then the industrial revolution, and now you've got the final uprooting, which is in some sense the going back and the shutting down of factories. So if I didn't like the creation of the factories to begin with, I suppose in some ways I should be quite happy that they're closing. But of course I'm not, because the point is that people build their lives around those things existing. They form communities and families and build relationships around that. And therefore you've got to be very careful about unpicking it. I should make it clear at this stage that this book is not a program for government. And I am simply reflecting upon how tradition has worked down through the ages. So if you and I were having this conversation 150 years ago, I would probably be arguing against the Industrial Revolution. The irony is that now, over a century later, that a whole community and a way of life is built up around it. I'm arguing for the preservation of that Industrial Revolution because I regret enormously the personal upheaval that's involved in unpicking it.
Do you think that's one of the problems with conservatism is that Conservatives spend years, decades even, fighting against something. They finally get used to it, and then they start protecting that. And people who are more progressive or what have you, kind of have seen that throughout history, and therefore tend to ignore conservative because they tend to think they are small men on the wrong side of history, as it were.
Well, they are and they're not, because this is where I slightly disagree with that title. As I said, they are reactionaries, and therefore they do react. And for that reason, conservatives of different generation can seem very different because they're defending a different consensus. This is why Disraeli, Thatcher, and now Boris Johnson, if you put them all in a room, they actually, again, they would agree on certain fundamental principles, but they would, in their application of them, seem very different. And actually, that's a great tool of conservatism. That's one of the reasons why the Conservative Party remains the most successful political party in the Western world for its length of time, except possibly the Republicans, because it has shown that adaptability and that ability to sell itself to adapt to change and then sell itself to the winners of that change. So one time it can sell itself in the 19th century to the new working class. In the late 20th century, it's able to sell itself to the middle class. So I think you could actually see it as a strength. But having said that, it's frustrating because conservatives can suddenly decide they like something that 50 years ago they didn't. And one example of that I always find curious is Republicans having adopted Martin Luther King Jr. as a spokesman for their model of racial equality and individual liberty. They did not think that 50 or 60 years ago. That's not what they were arguing. So sometimes it's very frustrating, and it can open itself up to charges of hypocrisy.
Where do you stand on Margaret Thatcher? Had you been around in government in the early 80s? Would you have been a Thatcherite or a Wet?
Well, the thing is that there was a very specific policy problem, which actually the Wets agreed with her on, and that was the domination of the trade unions and the decline of British industry. So actually, there was a basic agreement, but there was a lot of disagreement on much else, and I probably would have been one of the Wets. Thatcher is a classic example of the revolutionary force of capitalism. Everything that she wanted to preserve, and she did want to preserve tradition. She was a traditionalist. She had a clear idea in her mind of what England should be like. And she thought that it had been perverted by the state, that if you left people alone, they would revert to being like they were before the state came along, have strong families, strong communities, grocer shop, all that sort of stuff. I think where she got that wrong was that society had changed so dramatically since 1945 that peoples had adjusted to the new conditions, and they had built their life around the state, such that when you withdrew support for that factory or you shrank that aspect of the state, what actually happened is communities just died. And it unleashed a spirit within the country, which was very unconservative, which is a spirit of accumulation and materialism and greed, which inevitably destroys much of what conservatives like. Because what conservatives like often involves a great deal of modesty, humility, and self-sacrifice.
And so what would you have done instead, or did you agree that there is no alternative?
I think other countries did what she did in a different way. My model would have been Australia. And if it had been a Labour Party doing what she did, it might have managed to do it without the terrible sense of rancour and social division. But if you look at the macroeconomic and fiscal policy of Australia, and also some of its trade union stuff as well, it was doing Thatcherism. Bob Hawke just managed to do it in a way that brought the country with him and persuaded people of the necessity of it, rather than pitching it as an unfortunate conflict between interests and classes.
Quite a bit of mining still going on in Australia, though.
That's true. That's right. Well, that's the interesting one, isn't it? Do you want coal? I mean, that's the ultimate question for socialists and conservatives. Do you want coal? That's the big one, because it is a dirty, disgusting job. It was quite a bit safer by the 1980s than it had been before, but it's still a dirty, disgusting job, and it's a job of the past. So do you preserve something that bad just because it had such a strong cultural tradition? I'm not sure I know the answer, but I would have found it would have hurt me to have shut mines in a way that I think wouldn't hurt.
Yeah, the kind of nostalgia for mining that you get both on the left and parts of the right has always puzzled me, because there's such a big kind of artistic literature, apart from anything else, about how bloody awful the pits were and how people wanted to get away from them, how they didn't want their sons going down there, whether it was Kes or Billy Elliot or all the rest of these kind of things. It was always portrayed quite rightly as being a bloody awful job. And yet, as soon as it got closed down, and I agree that it wasn't done in the most sympathetic way, and obviously it did lead to a huge amount of hardship. But I think the idea that we should restart that particular industry rather than import it from Australia, or indeed not use it at all, I find quite baffling. But it is very common on, I'd say, both the left and parts of the right.
Absolutely, it is. I've actually written half a chapter on this subject. I have a chapter where I look at the miners, I look at Thatcher, and I think that part of the answer with the miners is that it became a way of defining a certain kind of working class pride, and particularly a masculine pride. There was amongst miners the sense that it's a horrible, hard job, undeniably, but because it was a horrible, hard job, there was some degree of pride and dignity at having done it, that it was coal that supported the empire, coal that got Britain through the war, and that the coal miners were the shock troops of socialism, and that socialism would be built on the basis of their work. So they developed a mythos, and that became very important to the left. And it was a mythos which was imbued with very conservative themes. And in fact, the Durham Miners' Gala was in some regards quite culturally conservative. And there were elements of the coal mining industry which were quite conservative, because they were about preserving a way of life in which they had pride.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned that the social conservatism as well of the left, because I was watching the Labour Party conference. Well, I wasn't watching it, but I saw various clips on Twitter of people speaking at the Labour Party conference. And for all Keir Starmer's efforts to kind of move on and what have you, a lot of the debate seemed to get bogged down on the question of whether men have cervixes. Yeah. And it strikes me that even if Starmer gets rid of the sort of hard left, that's only at most half the problem. I think if he can't move away from this kind of woke stuff, for want of a better word, this, and the nonsense that comes out of higher education these days, I don't see how he can win back the Red Wall or anybody else. Would you agree?
No, I think it's a real stumbling block. He could win them back if the economy gets so bad and national insurance kicks in, and your gas prices continue to go up. There is a certain logical dynamic to British politics that even Boris Johnson's charisma cannot entirely resist. But I agree with you that the woke stuff is a stumbling block. What I wonder is who's really behind it. I'm not sure it is a hard left thing, actually. I think that the hard left and Labour Party are still pretty focused on welfare and economic issues. They're off on their own.
No, sorry, I misunderstood. That's what I meant. I think he's got two problems. One is getting rid of the hard sort of economic left, as it were. Right. But then there's the whole, the woke left, as it were.
Yeah. Which is more of a metropolitan liberal thing, actually. It's more on the Remainer axis of things.
But can he afford to lose those people? Can he afford to be against, essentially students, or a huge number of students?
I think
he would just think he would be racist, sexist, all the rest of it if he doesn't stand up and say that men have cervixes.
He's not going to entirely get rid of them because he agrees with them. That's the key thing. That's why he's not denounced them or moved on, because he cannot bring himself to do it, either because he literally, by dictionary definition, agrees with their ideas on gender, or because he hates the thought of disagreeing with them. He hates the idea that they might be on the right side of history, that they're good people. Yeah. And he doesn't wish to be seen to disagree with them. So I doubt he will do it. He could afford to do it. Oh, definitely. Because where else are they going to go at this stage? They could go to the Green Party. And there is a great fear within the Labour Party of the left fracturing. But again, I think Labour's trick is patience and discipline. If it can show both, then the Tory government in a year or two's time is going to be in a very difficult place because of the fiscal position we've been left in. And if Labour just showed patience and discipline and just stopped talking about those things, that's the best way to handle the cervix issue, is to say, I don't care, move on. And I don't understand why Labour politicians can't just say, I don't care, move on.
Like you sound like you're pretty gloomy about the next year or two, economically. Go on, tell us why.
We're paying the bill for lockdown. And whether you thought lockdown was necessary or not, bits of it were. Bits of it's shocking that we didn't handle them better. But whether you thought it was necessary or not, the idea that you could shut down British society and the economy for about 12 to 18 months and there wouldn't be any economic consequence of that, I just find mad. I know you could argue that if you didn't, there would be even greater economic consequence because of the impact upon the NHS and health. But either way, we're now paying the bill. Plus, we have certain long-term structural weaknesses to do with the labour supply. I can just see the next year or two being really economically painful, with prices and taxes going up and a severe shortage of labour. And that's that really is the perfect storm for the left to win.
Yeah, I agree about inflation, and I'm glad that more and more people are waking up to the dangers of inflation. I think what's the Bank of England predicting now? 4% by the end of the year, is it?
By the end of the year.
Yeah.
I was slow on this one, partly because, in my defense, there is now a bizarre global consensus among central banks that inflation doesn't exist anymore. And that what really matters is investment in infrastructure, and you can just use QE and it has no consequence. There's always among central banks a consensus which develops after the fact and in the middle of things moving on. So there was a consensus developed around austerity a bit late and probably lingered too long. And likewise, there is now a consensus around, oh, you can just spend whatever you like. It's the personal journey of Janet Yellen, basically, right? She's imposing austerity probably a bit too long in the United States, but now she's all for spending at the very moment when actually you need to be really careful.
Overcorrecting, yeah.
Yeah, the basic problem is, and it's a fundamental rule of life, you can't spend what you don't create. You don't create wealth, you need to be careful about how much you spend. And in our economy, we have just in the last year spent without generating the economic growth to justify it. And there has to be a consequence for that.
And I would add that if you print money, you'll get inflation.
Of course.
And so many people in positions of authority have managed to push it out of their mind for so long, I guess, because we haven't had inflation for so long. We didn't get much inflation with the QE following the financial crisis. And that has led to, the most dangerous thing in economics, people thinking there's a new paradigm.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I agree.
Final question, Tim. How, or to what extent do you think that the modern Conservative Party aligns with your principles of conservatism?
Sometimes I think it's come around to me, actually, and I'm much closer to it. I really liked it during the high period of Brexit, when it was talking in that sort of blue Labour kind of way, which I really liked, a sort of big government conservatism. The problem is you're dealing with politicians, and they have to turn principles into policy. And they tend to do so on the basis of a narrow political calculus rather than actually what's the right thing to do. And so while for instance, you take social care, I'm all for fixing it. It is a traditionalist thing to want to do. But the focus really ought to be upon families, and it should be upon social insurance, and it should be upon developing markets. It should not be a raid of national insurance to spend on who knows what, because there is not even a plan for social care on the table yet. So philosophically, yes, I think the Conservative Party has shifted away from Thatcherism, back towards my position. But unless it actually has policies that work and are sensible, it's going to end up blowing that philosophy apart because it will be seen to have failed. And there's a risk that it becomes a retread of Heathism, which is the worst kind of reactionary politics, where you just react to something going wrong and then think, I better spend to keep people happy. That's the worst kind of reactionary politics, and that's not truly conservative, I think.
I would certainly agree. I think maybe it needs to be a return to Thatcherism, but apart from that, I think I agree. Tim, that's it. We're out of time. That's our 30 minutes done. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you at home for tuning in to another Swift Half with Snowdon. I'll be back in a couple of weeks. I think I need to get a bit of makeup. I'm looking a bit shiny in this bright light. I'm back in the office. I don't know where I'll be next time, perhaps even in person with a guest. Thank you in particular if you do donate to the IEA. If you don't, or if you want to give us more, or if you want to go onto our Patreon, please do. It's, I think I've got the address right now. I think it's patreon.com/IEA. The donate website is iea.org.uk/donate. Thank you in particular to our top tier Patreons, Donald Blaney, Eric Keane, James Burns, Mark Edwards, Philip Azouf, Richard Leader, Robert Appleby and Timothy Wall. You're all absolute legends. Please continue to give us some cash, particularly for digital projects like this. Take care. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Goodbye.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.